Hello and welcome back to the Ocrit D&D Ravion campaign. In our last video, the party had awoken in a pool of their own blood with no wounds to speak of, save for Sudi, who had sliced herself up in an attempt to draw suspicion from herself. They had also struggled to wrangle their individual party members before visiting the city lawmaster for more information on the Haze and her involvement with the criminal syndicate. They infiltrated the Haze hideout and secured a meeting with the syndicate's leadership. Though unable to prove to be of value to the syndicate, they were thrown into the waste chamber with a drug-addled Odiug before crawling their way back out to the surface to recover in the local hospital. We pick up now on a relatively peaceful morning in the hospital. Nurses tend to the sick and wounded, folding linens in the soft morning sunlight that shines through the many windows. In their respective beds, the party awakes, bandaged and treated for infection thanks to the hospital staff. Terrified by their encounter in the hospital beds the night before, Flawed and Sudi each looked themselves over. Flawed, finding the spot where a lock of his hair had been cut, and consequently freaking out, and Sudi finding an ominous slice across her palm, unsettled by the fact that this visit was apparently not a dream. Realizing that she had also then missed her trial date, Sudi convinced the party to destroy any evidence of their presence at the hospital, hoping to skip town before they could prosecute her. It was at this point that the party collected their gear from their underbed storage that it had been placed in, and with hushed voices, hatched a plan. Lemba and Lothric began to put on a sort of faux fight, pulling each other's hair and punching and kicking each other across the hospital floor, while Sudi disguised herself as a nurse in an attempt to blend in with the other nursing staff. X and Serenity, totally over the entire situation, left the hospital to find some breakfast, and Jade stood watching the fight with this dumbfounded expression. And as she looked on, Lemba, in an attempt to cause an even greater disturbance, used the fire spell to light the hospital ablaze. As the flames grew, she controlled them to spread as much as possible throughout this interior, as she pretended to fight the entire time. The hospital staff, understandably terrified, were now standing in a burning building, gathered up their patients, and rushed out of the building, or at least one did, as the remaining three just left the building. Jade, Flawed, and Lemba then hurried to rescue the remaining patients before escaping themselves. On the way out, Lemba entered a back room just off of the entryway, discovering a bedchamber of sorts, and finding little of interest, leapt out the window into the back alley with a crash of shattering glass. Standing outside, Sudi and Flawed and Jade watched on as this hospital slowly burned in front of them. And suddenly, a woman from the crowd of onlookers, with a gasp, rushed into the building. She was dressed in the hospital's staff clothes, and appeared to be a doctor or surgeon of some sort. After a moment's hesitation, Flawed ran into the building after her, with Sudi following him shortly after. Re-entering the building now, they were surrounded by flames and smoke, with no sign of the doctor that had rushed in ahead of them. Flawed, turning, saw the door to the back room that Lemba had entered, slightly ajar, and a set of stairs to his right side. Pointing to the back room, he told Sudi to check that room for her as he rushed down the stairs, and Sudi, entering the room, found only the journal on a desk and the shattered window that Lemba had left through. With a shrug, Sudi picked up the journal and returned to the front of the hospital to stand with Jade, leaving Flawed to his own search. Frustrated with Flawed at this point, much of the party is fine to let him do his own thing, though unfortunately this would not work well. Flawed, making his way down the stairs, found himself in the stone basement of the hospital that serves as this morgue and crematorium and storage space for the supplies that they need. At the end of a long hallway, he saw a figure enter a dark room and rushed after them. Creeping down the hall, Flawed peeked into the room, seeing two figures. The doctor that he had been following, and a young man in dark robes, making their way to a cellar door at the back of the room. The woman threw the cellar door open as Flawed entered the room, standing on a ladder as she did. Whirling around, the pair registered Flawed, who walked up to the young man, recognizing his face as he got closer in the darkness. Jared, the server from Timber Falls that Sudi had humiliated and ruined his life, the one that Flawed had then met with in the alleyway, stood before them. "Just deal with him and hurry up," Jared's companion said with a slight sigh before climbing out of the cellar door and off into the alleyway. Turning to Flawed, Jared, holding a familiar pair of dark and ominous daggers, looked conflicted. How could he kill his own creator? Flawed, just as a refresher here, had seen Jared in the back alley of Timber Falls as they were leaving town. After Sudi had failed to convince him to go off and take revenge for all of the suffering he had on his owner, Carmilla Falcon, for the different taverns that he worked in there, she had been stopped by X. It's probably the best way to put it this way. And X told him to go off. There's a job at the end of the alleyway she's aware of. Go off and find it. Flawed then disappeared, leaving the party to go on ahead and meet up with the princess before he continued on his way. Flawed, in this time, met up with the young man at the other side of the alleyway, and giving him a dark dagger, told him to go off and find Carmilla and kill her, just because it would be fun. Now, conflicted, for how could he kill his creator? Jared stood there, staring into the face of Flawed, who, then holding his wrists out, smiled at the young man and said, "It's okay, just cut me up a little bit. Do what you have to do." With an apologetic smile in return, Jared sunk both daggers into Flawed's arms, raking them down and shredding his flesh before slashing into Flawed's chest, sending him tumbling to the floor. Bleeding out across the stonework of this musty basement, Flawed lay there, and Jared knelt down beside him, cradling his head as he lay dying on the floor. "I'm sorry, but thank you," he said as Flawed's eyes focused in on the young man's face. "It's okay," Flawed responded before feeling a dagger sink into the side of his chest, just beneath his armpit, piercing deep into his heart as it pumped its final beat. The last thing Flawed saw as Jared stood over him was a sad look on his face before the young man climbed out of the basement after his companion. Outside of the hospital, with flames roaring an angry roar, Sudi, Lemba, and Jade waited for Flawed, unaware of his fate as Darian Goldhand arrived with a collection of town guards. He rushed to them to ask what had happened and where everyone else was. Sudi telling him that Flawed had run back inside of the burning hospital. In an act of bravery, Darian rushed into the still-burning building to retrieve Flawed, hoping to save his life from the blaze. With X and Serenity seeing the smoke from where they had been sitting eating breakfast, they determined to make their way back to the hospital, and, as they arrived, the remainder of the party worked with the city guards to put out the blaze, carrying buckets of water from the nearby wells to hopefully save the building structure. Their efforts yielded little as they watched the hospital slowly crumble to ash, a leveled structure by the time that they did finally put out the flames. Darian Goldhand then emerged from the basement structure, slamming the charred timbers out of the way, and carrying the body of Flawed, scorched and singed and streaked with blood. Offering his condolences to the party, he gave them the body to bury, and asked to see them later in the day to discuss Sudi's trial verdict, as they had simply proceeded without her. Grieving for their lost friend, the party expressed their sorrow in an odd way, returning to the Dancing Dryad Tavern and putting the corpse of Flawed into a bath, before freezing the water around it and jamming the body into Jade's bag of holding, effectively putting their friend on ice for the moment. Then, returning to the Swells district of Fallfield to meet Darian for the details on Sudi's trial, and debrief on what the party knew at this point about the Hayes and murders, they passed the Lawmaster Simone Williamson's house, where they saw her hanging by 3 long metal poles above her doorway, stabbed through her chest. Dead and bleeding onto the front stoop, they watched as she slowly turned a familiar golden sheen, and then finally to ash, dusting off into the breeze as her body shifted from its hanging state to a pile of bloody dust on her front stoop. Meeting up with Darian Goldhand, the party told them about the Hayes location, which Darian very quickly sent his second-in-command to lead a raid on while they continued their meeting. The party then also told him of Jared and his apparent connection to the murders that had been happening. Paying the party for these efforts, Darian then grew solemn as he turned to Sudi. In missing her trial date, the gnomish victim of her crimes had called for the maximum penalty, capital punishment, in the form of a death sentence. But, in light of a recent announcement of a war between the Labette Empire and the Mistkeep Mining Guild, they had agreed, instead of following the called for and ridiculous maximum punishment, charge her a fine to support the war effort for soldiers' training and equipment, as the Remont Empire was going to send military support to their ally, the Mistkeep Mining Guild. The total sum to be paid after Sudi had begun to pay off her debt with the 2 completed jobs and some of the money in her pockets was 5,000 gold pieces. And in an effort to support this endeavor, Darian offered them some additional jobs. For the price of 2,500 gold for Sudi and 500 gold each for the remainder of the party, they would serve as protective couriers for whatever amount of mysterious drugs that the raid had procured. Aware of this gold powder-inducing drug, Darian had already arranged for a researcher contact in the city of Moonshade to investigate and get as much information on the new drug that the Hayes had syndicated over time here. He just needed some couriers. The party, in agreeing to be these drug runners, then waited for Darian to bring them a satchel full of the confiscated drugs, and then decided to leave to meet up with the researcher contact he had in the city of Moonshade. Drugs and Flawed's body in tow, the party then left the city of Swallfield and found an old, gnarled tree to bury their companion. Thawing him out, they lay him in the hole that they dug before Lemba realized that within his heart, they suspected, was a familiar blue teardrop-shaped gemstone. Climbing atop her dead companion, Lemba took a knife and set to work cutting open his chest. Pulling from within his heart and the teardrop gemstone. Her actions of the day pushing Lemba too far from neutral. As a Nephilim, she was forced to make a wisdom saving throw. This throw she failed, gaining a temporary madness. In this case, Lemba forgot the events of the last 24 hours, and coming to consciousness, straddling Flawed's body, and holding his heart and a dagger in her hand, she had no recollection of the events that led up to his death, and blamed herself for killing him. She was then only aware of the individual struggles within the Hayes court and Odiug fight, with the last memory she had being splashing down into the moat, kind of overflow area of the deep shore, before she sits now above her dead friend. Now, Flawed, in his past, had made a contract with the goddess the Dark Deceiver for a long life, and in his death he was sent to meet with her. For a time, they discussed the conditions of his return to life and his new life's purpose should he choose to do so. Flawed considering the effects of his decision, bargaining back and forth for a new weapon, greater purpose, additional power. And as he sat there in thought, he looked at this opportunity before him. He did have this opportunity before him to return to life, more powerful than before, with a greater purpose than before. But would he take it? Thank you all for turning back in for Session 8 of the Ravion campaign. Tune in next time to see if Flawed is chosen to return to life, and for insights on his deal with the goddess, the Dark Deceiver. Remember, it doesn't take much to make a difference out there, so be the change that you want to see in the world, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.